tips and some techniques for discovering the hidden dynamics in your relationships. One of the things that I've really come to love about constellation work is it so quickly shows us what's going on in our families and in our businesses and our organizations. So it has a way of really helping us see what the dynamics are. And once we see those dynamics, things that have sort of been operating, but we didn't know how or why people did the things that they did, or why we did the things that we did, once we can see those dynamics, then we have an option of making choices. So part of this webinar's purpose is just to help you think of some ways and to experience some ways of understanding how we come to conclusions in relationships that aren't always accurate, and how you can discover different ways of looking at what's happening in relationships that are important to you. So, along with the musical chimes in the background here, I would like to, I'm not sure if there's a way for me to mute that sound, I apologize. So I'd like to just go to our first point here. And the point I'd like to make here is that so often when we're in the middle of a pattern, when we're in the middle of a situation and we have that awful feeling like, I've been here before, I don't like what's happening, and I just feel stuck in this situation, and I know what's going to happen next, and I'm probably not going to like it. When we find ourselves in one of those kind of repeating patterns, very often in that moment, we're looking through the experience that we're having. We're looking through our perspective at the situation. And so when we're embedded in something, it's really hard for us to see the pattern that unfolds over time. So one of the first things that we can do is change our perspective. So in this little webinar, we're going to explore how we get stuck looking through our own eyes, how we make conclusions when we do that, where other clues could come that might give us a different point of view, and how we can use that change in point of view to get a handle on what's happening and why things unfold the way we do in our relationships. And I'll give you just a little example that I'll follow up with at the end. I've been married this is a personal story, I've been married for I think 37 years now. And it didn't always go so well for me at the beginning. And of course, I was very embedded in my own perspective. And over the years, one of the things that's been super helpful for me is to be able to look at what we do rather than through my point of view. So I'll tell you a little bit more at the end about some things that I did that shifted my relationship. And hopefully that's got your curiosity up a bit. But this idea of the one thing, you can't always change the other, but you certainly can change your point of view. So one of the places we get information about our relationships is just through our senses. So these hidden dynamics, these patterns, like what my husband and I were doing that was making us unhappy, there was information. I mean, I could sense and feel that things weren't going right, but I didn't always know why. And my mind self, had a lot of stories about, what was wrong with him usually, or what was wrong with the other person. But I had also a body feeling that maybe I had something to do with it, or maybe there was something I was missing. And this idea that, our mind thinks it's in charge, the I in the head that tells the stories thinks it's in charge. But there's another part of you, and that's your body self, that's tracking your place in your relationship. And it's interested in your safety and survival. Now it's funny, I had a hard time finding this picture. Most of the pictures I could find had a big head and a little body. And in this webinar, we're going to find out that the body has information that is useful to the mind, that can help you come up with different ideas about what's going on in your relationships. So one of the key questions that your body self is asking is, should I approach someone or avoid them? And if you think about close relationships, if you've ever been, frozen out in a relationship, when somebody's avoiding you, or they're coming on too strong and not getting your signals of like back off, this idea of approach and avoid is really important for us as people. We need to know that we'll be safe. We need to know which people we can approach, which people we need to avoid. So it's a real basic thing, that a way of sorting what we do in any relationship. And when I work with people, I find that this tendency, approach, avoid, is at the root of a lot of relational dynamics. So it's usually through our body sense that we make that choice. It's not so much a conscious choice. And I want to explore that with you just a little bit. So of course, we learn things by seeing, hearing, and feeling. So a lot of information comes into our body and our senses that doesn't make it to our conscious mind. And oftentimes we have a feeling about it, but we don't know what we saw or heard. So I want to just take a moment here and have you look at this woman's face. Maybe you met her in the hallway at work or something, and you said, "How are you?" And she said, "I'm fine, thanks." And if you look at this face, what do you think? Is she fine? Somebody just tell me, just unmute yourself. I'm not sure why I have red lines on my screen here. Just go ahead and unmute yourself and say whether you think she's completely fine or not. We have one or two people do that.
I don't think she looks fine.
Okay, there's one vote for she's not fine. All right.
Yeah, not fine.
Okay, let's so
not fine at all.
Not fine at all, right? So we're seeing, she's saying she's fine, but we're seeing something different. We're seeing something in her face that counteracts what she's saying. So let me have somebody else say, what else do you see? She's smiling. What else do you see in her face? What emotion do you see? Go for it. We've decided she's not happy. So what might she be feeling?
She looks like she's about to cry. She's very sad, like she's holding something back.
Exactly. We can see her eyebrows are lifted, particularly towards the center. We can see the pinch in her eyes. So we can see that she's feeling something different than she's saying. So here's another question for you. When you see her face and she says, "I'm fine, thanks," she says, "I'm fine, thanks," how do you feel? What's your feeling when you say, you get this face and you have someone say, "I'm fine, thanks"? How do you feel?
I feel uncomfortable because of the lack of congruence between what she's saying and what she is projecting through her face.
Right. So we feel that even though we're getting a message that she's fine, our body self, that discomfort that we feel, is picking up the ambiguity. It's picking up the contradiction. Now, this happens oftentimes in our daily life really quickly. You might just pass somebody in the hall and they say, "I'm fine, thanks," but you have that face. And it may not make it to your conscious awareness. And you do receive the message. So this is one way where just paying attention to that body sense when you see something is really helpful. Now, of course, seeing is one mode. Here's another one. These two people are having a conversation, right? They're on the phone with each other, but it's sort of, what's your sense? Are they having the same conversation, or maybe is there a different conversation that each one of them are having? What do you think? Somebody unmute. Tell me what you think.
Well, one of them is into it, and the other one looks like, "I need to get my nails done."
Yeah, right. So So if you didn't see them though, and you just had the vocal thing, do you think you could pick it up? Do you think you'd hear that? I mean, we can see this, but if you were just hearing these two voices, what's your thought? Would you pick that up?
I couldn't see how you couldn't.
Yeah, she looks pretty disinterested, huh? Right. So this is one of those other cases of incongruence where the prosody, the melody of the voice and the words don't add up. And again, it's going to create that discomfort in us. It's going to create that feeling of, even if we're incongruent or they're incongruent, we're going to have that uncomfortable feeling. So that dissonance often underlies patterns that are dysfunctional. Now, I've kind of focused on patterns that are dysfunctional in this little slideshow to this point, but I also want to point out that functional patterns can be those experiences you have with another person where you feel good and you don't know why. So we make our relationships out of our interactions, moment by moment, exchange by exchange, hello in the hall, phone conversations, whatever. These things over time build up our expectations. They build up the way we approach a person. And we often make conclusions based on data that our body senses are picking up, but that don't always make it to our conscious awareness. And sometimes because we've made these conclusions and we haven't caught them as they've unfolded, we act into situations in ways that create part of the pattern that we don't like. So one of the things that we've learned in the research is that the mind is like that red balloon. It leaves home, it leaves the body pretty often. If you've been driving home and found yourself that you missed your turn off because your mind was dreaming, your body was handily driving the car, but your mind was daydreaming, you'll know what I mean. It's like the body and the mind don't always work on the same channel. And the way that works is that we often observe something. Say these people in that conversation had a number of conversations like that. The fellow might be having an experience of it. And maybe he's only picking up the times that she laughs. He's not paying attention to some of the times when she sounds bored. So he might pick up the data that he wants to hear, or he might just pick up part of the data. And then he's going to make sense of it. I interpret what I have. I'm adding a bit of memory and expectations, whatever. And then he might make an assumption about, well, she's really into me, or she really likes me, or, maybe there's a future here. And then he might say, well, this is because I'm a really good guy and people like me. And so he acts on the basis of those assumptions. So another example of this is perhaps I go to a meeting or maybe I'm running a meeting. And like, for example, Cindy, my assistant, if I didn't know her well, I might say, wow, she didn't make it to the meeting. And I might not think of all the times that she did make a meeting. And based on that, I might say, wow, she's often late. So that's who she is. And then I might assume something like, well, you just can't count on Cindy to be here. And then from there, I might go straight to an assumption like, well, I always have to do it on my own. Now, the next time I see Cindy, I'm going to act out of that assumption. I'm going to operate out of that belief I've made. And this happens in a nanosecond. We do this super quickly. The mind is very fast when it's just using its imagination like that. Does this make sense to people? Does somebody say, are we on the track here? Somebody give me some verbal feedback because I don't have the chat available. Is this making sense to you?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yes.
Okay, you've ever been here? So I'm going to invite you just to try this for yourself. We're going to start at the bottom of the ladder. So if you go to the bottom of this list, you'll say, think of a time when there's something that you observed and you remembered that. I'm just going to give you a chance to go up the ladder and then back down and think about, maybe something happened or somebody said something. And as you reflect on it now, you can think of how you interpreted that, how you made meaning out of that. what bits of your memory you brought into interpreting that. And then just notice when you sit with that feeling of how easy it is to just make an assumption. Because one of the mind's functions is to keep us safe. So it's going to try to anticipate danger. And it's a little bit biased that way. So, of course, we think about the possible consequences. They could be, like what we want to have happen, like our fellow who's in the phone call. Or they could be like, me in the meeting. And then based on that assumption, notice how easy it is to form a belief. And just think about that for a minute and see if there's an example that comes to mind. And if you think about that belief and you start maybe to unpack it, to think about the assumptions you might have made and what meaning you made from something that happened and what other data might have been there that you could notice. And just see if that shifts the way you think about that experience or not. Does anyone have an example that they'd be willing to share of a trip up the ladder?
I had a situation at work many years ago where um, they hired a new manager, and because of the position I was in, I just got along with her. And one of the owners was having a problem with the manager. And so there was tension, and I had interpreted the owner's intention, the energy, as she was distancing herself from me. And she thought I really liked this manager. So like there was kind of like, once we finally had a conversation of, no, like I see the problems with this manager, I'm just being pleasant.
Yeah, sure. Uh-huh.
And it turned out, the owner of the company wasn't upset with me at all, so it was an interesting little dance, and I was really grateful that she and I eventually had a conversation and cleared it up.
Perfect. That's a great example, Susan. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
It happens so fast. We don't even think about it. So we can see how these patterns happen, how we select a bit of information, we make an assumption, our bodies may be telling us something's off, but we don't actually know what it is. And then once we start acting on that, then we can create patterns where the other person is doing something, just as you pointed out, Susan, because they think, we're taking a certain position. So it's really easy to get into these tangles with each other. And unless we have a clarifying conversation, they can go on and create really difficult situations for us. So I hope this makes sense in terms of how easy it is, how we edit things out, and how important the body information is. So once we do catch ourselves feeling that sense of incongruity, and we're kind of wondering, have I made a conclusion about this perhaps too rapidly, or is there something else I could notice because I'm feeling that dissonance? The question then is, what to do? And this is where it's really helpful to be able to kind of ask yourself, what am I assuming about this situation? What do I believe to be true here? What do I believe to be true about the way the world works? So, do you have an assumption that people are acting out of positive intentions? Or do you tend to see the world as people being, antagonistic or conflict? They're in conflict with you. It's as you start to look at that, you can start to find your, what bias you have, and it may depend on the context. You may be pessimistic and assume the worst about your family, but be cheerful and optimistic at work. So just taking a moment to say, what do I think is going on here? What are the assumptions I could be making? And examining those, that's a really good place to start. And once you've been willing to kind of distance yourself that way, to start to look at what you're doing and at what you're experiencing rather than through the lens of that experience, That's the first step towards becoming curious. And curiosity is like one of the most beautiful things to bring to a difficult pattern. Partly because when we're curious, we become open to learning. We become open to experience and discovering something new and something different. The third thing that's really helpful, so shifting your view to looking at, what does she do? What does I do? How do we do this dance together? Where am I? Have I gone up the ladder? And being curious is to assume that the other person is acting for a positive reason for themselves. So often it's easy to take a, a self-based perspective and assume that the other might be doing something to hurt us because we feel hurt. So that would be congruent with our felt sense. So this idea of really taking a positive intention for yourself and for the other. What are we each trying to do that is making this, for ourselves, that's making this situation difficult? Whatever the pattern is, you and the other person are making it together. And so being willing to look at what you can do is a place where you have some agency and you have a chance to make a change. Once you have that idea, and again, the body sense of incongruity is a place to start, you can ask yourself, when did this pattern start? What else was happening at that time? Was there something going on that created that difficulty for us? Who has to be present for this pattern to unfold? Is it just me and my coworker? Is it just me and my partner? Or does my mother have to be involved for us to run this little triangle of victim, rescuer, and perpetrator? Who's there and what was happening? And are there things that make that situation, that common situation, go better for us or worse? And what does that tell me about how we make this pattern together? And then the place where you can make a change is, what do I do to contribute to this pattern? Where's my role in that? And what if I did something different? Now, one of the things that we know about ERPs, or unwanted repetitive patterns, is that they usually happen by the third turn in a conversation. So if my partner said something and it was something that I got upset about, I might react to that. And then if he reacted to my reaction, we'd be in the pattern. So what that means is you have places where you can change the pattern. For example, if my husband said something to me and it was upsetting to me, I could take that moment and breathe and decide to do something different and see what would happen. That right there would interrupt our usual pattern. Or he could approach me differently. Maybe he notices that I always get triggered when he says, something about the cost of our groceries or whatever. He could approach me differently, or he could react to my response differently. So there's at least 3 places in there where we can change the pattern. So just idea of, where are the places where we are often running, and how can I act into that might shift that pattern? So it's really this idea of following the cues. Turn by turn in our conversations, we make these patterns. So at each turn in a conversation, it could be down turn 4. You have a choice. You can be brave. You can try something else. Instead of being angry, you could try compassion, or you could try humor, or you could listen to learn something rather than defend yourself. You can imagine walking in that person's shoes. And it's important always to remember to have self-compassion too. So that concludes the sort of talking part of this little mini webinar. I would love to open the mic to questions. If you have, to a little discussion time on this topic. There's lots more I could share. I just put a few pieces together here so we'd have a place to start this conversation. And I'd love to hear some questions and answers. And I'm going to actually stop sharing so that I can see you and hear you. Okay. Yeah, Karen.
Jane, could you say a little bit more about ERPs? I've never heard that expression before, so that would be wonderful. Thank you.
ERPs is a term that one of my mentors when I was in graduate school coined, and it's unwanted repetitive patterns. And he was part of a team that developed a new form of understanding communication called coordinated management of meaning. And they developed this by filming Salvador Minuchkin, who's one of the premier family therapists. And so they would film him doing a session, and then they would go away in the afternoon and try and analyze it and then come back. And what they noticed is this pattern that we are very habitual human beings. We do that to save energy. We try to make things as simplified as possible in our behaviors patterns with people. So we very often create these patterns where somebody says something, there's a response. It's almost like we've rehearsed it. The person knows the next thing to do. And we'll do these things over and over again. So this is why he said they're unwanted repetitive patterns. And the other thing they learned, and the thing they learned by watching this expert therapist, was there's places in the unfolding pattern of conversation where if somebody acted differently than the normal way of doing things, the whole pattern could shift. So there's an enormous amount of power right there. Does that make sense?
It does. And you mentioned the 3 places. Would you mind just saying those again?
So if you're the person who starts the pattern, you can approach differently. And that can be things like the tone of your voice. You know, if you're breathing high or you're tense to bring something up with somebody, that alone might be a trigger for them. You can, you know, begin to use different language. You can frame it differently. So the first one is like how you approach somebody if you start the pattern. The second thing is if you're the second person, you're the responder, your turn 2. You know, it's like taking a deep breath, realizing that this is a pattern, that, you know, how many times have we done this? Try something different. Try a different response. The third is if you're the one who initiated it, you get the same old response. Again, you have choice. Start being creative, trying some humor or compassion or an apology, or, you know, just trying a different kind of speech act, doing something different with your speech and your behavior. Those things can shift the pattern. So
That's very helpful. Thank you.
sure. Thanks, Karen.
And sorry, say again
Sure.
the name of the, this was
put
your mentor who put this together?
Yeah, I'll put this in, it's Barnett Pierce,
Okay,
and I'll just put that in the chat. And
great.
he's written 2 books. He's written a book called Making Social Worlds, which is a really wonderful unpacking of our communication patterns. He's also written one, I think it's called Interpersonal Communication, which is a textbook that has a lot of great examples of this kind of thing in it. So he was a really wonderful teacher for me. And the cool thing, if you're a constellation person, is you can actually see repeating patterns on the floor. You can hear people who will tell you that the narrative that they tell you will have both parts of the unwanted repetitive pattern in it. They'll tell you this happens and then I do this. So it's all there. You can often see this kind of stuff. Yeah. Thanks, Karen. Anyone else? Other questions or comments? Would love to hear from you. Please just unmute yourself and speak up. You can even turn your video on if you have a question.
So do you see this coming up in family systems? Like the mother does this and then,
Absolutely. Yeah, we have these things like well rehearsed sometimes. You know, in fact, you know, this is a really common issue. You can see triangles operate this way. It isn't just 2 people, you know, like the wife is unhappy with the husband, so she drags the teenage boy in, starts picking a fight with him, which triggers the dad to react in a certain way, which takes the heat off her. I mean, these kinds of things are really, if you start looking, we do them a lot more than we are aware of. And oftentimes it is that body sense that's our first cue. And then if we start to really have the tools to think about what are my assumptions, what have I done here, we actually have a lot of opportunity to change these patterns. Yeah. Anything else, Connie?
Yeah, I just had something and then I just lost it.
Okay.
So do you kind of have, so do you sense this? You see it when it's coming up, or do you have it in your body, or do you ask them, like in this, curving road pattern?
Yeah.
Do you ask them how they feel, and so that they can be aware of it, or how to like?
So often people, so I've got a lot of training. I was one of Barnett's students, so I'm lucky. I feel really blessed. So often, if you really start to pay attention and you've kind of trained yourself to go, okay, they said this, and then what happens next, and then how did they react? You'll start to see it. You'll start to hear it. Or even in noticing in yourself, like I always react to my partner when they say something, negative to me. Like, so I'll tell the rest of my story here. So the first 5 years of my marriage were kind of tough. And I remember once sitting in a doctor's office and reading a magazine and John Gottman's articles. He's a wonderful marriage and family therapist, was there with the research that he did. And he said something like, for marriages to make it, there have to be 5 positive interactions to every negative one. And at that moment, I was thinking, I'm not sure we would hit that score. So I went home and I decided that I was going to make myself say 5 nice things to my husband before I complained. And by golly, somehow he got nicer. And that was a turning point in our relationship. And because I realized that, I was having negative reactions no matter what he said. How's the weather? And that by taking a different response, by responding differently into those turns, it shifted the whole dynamic of the patterns that we were running. So that was my first early encounter with this. I didn't have Barnett's theory at the time, but hey, it worked. It helped. So does that make sense?
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, it kind of reminds me of 12-step work, because it seems like when you start doing your work,
yeah,
your spouse gets a lot nicer. So
I know. Lovely how that works, huh?
Yeah. All right. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank
Sure.
you.
You're welcome. Yeah. Someone else? Is there anyone else who's got a topic or question?
Jane, what if someone's resistant to change? Like you could do all the work possible, and then they just would rather not.
Well, then I think you're going to have to step one step farther back and say, is this a relationship?
Oh,
Are they
come back.
So you got to look at, what are we trying to do? I'm trying to make this, but what are they telling me by their reaction? Are
Wow.
they me? Maybe not. So then the choice is back to me again. What do I do?
Wow. Good point. Thank you.
Sometimes we'll work really hard and we'll stay in an herb because we don't want the answer. And so by taking that deep breath and standing back and looking at, what are we making here? What happens when we do this? Then we set ourselves up for some real choice. So take a deep breath.
That's great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Jane.
Okay, thanks, Willa. Yeah. Someone else? Anyone else? Question, comment?
Well, to piggyback off that, then what if it's a child or a brother or something, and it's not a, intimate, a romantic relationship?
Mm-hmm. Well, we have to also, there's lots of things we could say about that. It's a little more involved conversation. And, this is where doing things like walking in their shoes, or really trying to understand what is their positive intention. And how, if I understand that, listening to learn, these are kind of different strategies around what is going on for them, like getting out of my own view, my own lens, stop looking through my view and looking at it and saying, okay, can I even step into their view and step into their shoes? And do I actually have the space in my heart to hear and listen to what they might say? We often do. One of the things that's at the basis of a lot of herbs is we often do things because we've gone up the ladder, and we think we're doing things to protect ourselves or the other person. When we actually have that conversation, like Susan pointed out, those assumptions fall away, and we can actually understand each other better. But so often we're down the pattern before we're in it, and it's hard to remember to get out.
So could you set up a personal constellation with yourself, with just objects or paper or whatever?
Yeah.
That's when you said step into their shoes, I thought, oh, that would be kind of like a personal.
Yeah, you can actually put 2 pieces of paper down on the floor, stand in your place, stand in their place, and really open your heart and imagine what is going on for them. And then perhaps based on that, you might be able to construct a different kind of conversation with them where you don't go down the herb, because your perspective has shifted a bit.
Yeah, excellent.
Are we looking at each other? Are they looking away and I'm looking at their back? How do we stand in relationship to each other? Is it possible to have a conversation from here?
Yeah.
So that can be a very helpful little thing to do to interrupt an herb.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Connie. One more question, if there is one, for tonight. Or not. Okay. I would love to have you either in the chat, or if you want to pop on and say what stands out for you, what you took away from today's conversation. I'd love to have you just share with us. What did you learn? What was useful to you? That's partly for you, so you can remember it too. Yeah. Anyone want to share?
I really like the herb stuff.
Yeah, it's really useful.
Yeah. I like, and I know that feeling. I know that feeling of when I get triggered, and luckily my husband has done enough work on himself. He knows when he gets triggered, and we got a rescue dog a few weeks ago, and there's been a lot of triggering going on. So,
so
it's nice to just have clarity on that.
Sure. Thanks, Susan. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? Things that you might like to share?
5 positives to 1 negative. I thought that was very good.
Thank John Gottman for that one. Yeah. Okay. That's a minimum, by the way. Hopefully there's more. Yeah. All right.
I like the should I approach or avoid, asking that question, because I actually have that going on with my daughter right now. So, yeah, that was, it just sort of brought some stuff right to the surface for me.
Okay. I hope that's good. All right. Thanks.
Yeah, no, yeah,
Okay. Thanks. Yeah. Anyone else?
I'm very aware of the call to bravery in this, and so I love the list. Your last slide, compassion, humor. The different things that you can bring to a conversation. But I have that. I'm having that reaction of like, oh my God, it all comes back to being courageous and just and just having to kind of keep one's seat in the face of one's own momentum and the other person's momentum, and just how at the end of the day it's just you have to kind of sit there and stay open, which is of course the hardest thing to do.
Yeah, Brownett had a phrase that I'm still trying to live into. He's talked about approaching things like that, where you called it being profoundly open to the other while firmly standing your own ground. And I thought that was just such a beautiful phrase, and it's a challenge.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks a lot. Okay. Well, I can see that I had a commitment to be done by 7:15, and so I can see that we're approaching that time. So for all of you who joined us for this little mini webinar, I hope you got a tasty little bite to take with you, and thanks for those who shared what they're taking with them. Yeah, thank you, and I look forward to seeing you at the next one. So take care. Connie?
Yeah, actually, I was curious. I was making some notes and I kind of missed one of those slides on the
Mm-hmm.
that second slide on the pattern. Are you
Yeah.
sending this out?
Yeah,
to,
we will. We'll send you a slide.
Okay. Okay, great. Cool. Thank you
Okay.
so much, Jane. I
All
appreciate
right.
it.
Yeah, thanks, Connie.
Mhm.
All right. Take care, everyone.